They are shocking figures. Latest US official calculations show greenhouse gases at their highest level ever. The statistics for CO2 emissions are higher than a worst-case scenario outlined by climate change experts just 4 years ago. This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm James Bays. The US Energy Department has said the amount of carbon dioxide emissions has jumped to a new record level. It's calculated that the world pumped about 512 million metric tonnes more CO2 into the air in 2010 than it did in 2009. That's an increase of about 6%. A big part of that total came from emissions caused by burning coal. That was up nearly 8% in 2010. The levels of greenhouse gases are higher than even a worst-case scenario that was drawn up by climate experts just 4 years ago. The new figures show pollution in China and the US account for more than half of the increases. Well, joining us now are our three guests. Firstly, we have Charlie Kronic, a member of the Greenpeace Energy and Climate team. Also with us is David Henderson, former head of economics and statistics at the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. He's also a member of the Global Warming Policy Foundation. And rounding off our panel, Fred Pearce, an environmental consultant and contributor to New Scientist magazine. Gentlemen, welcome to the programme. Let's start with Fred Pearce. Tell me, Fred, are you surprised by these figures?
I am, and I'm really rather alarmed by them as well, because when the Western economies are flatlining, it's really very alarming to see such large increases in emissions. I think these are mostly coming from developing countries, particularly from China and India, both of which rely a lot on coal to burn their energy. So the really scary thing is that even though we're talking for many years about climate change, the proportion of our energy that is coming from burning coal, the dirtiest fuel, continues to increase, and that is a real threat to the planet.
Mr. Henderson, do you believe these figures? Do you think they're true?
Yes, I think the Energy Information Administration is very good about this, and I think you'll find that other sources will confirm them.
How worried are you?
Well, less worried than Fred Pearce, I think, because don't take it as for granted that this puts the planet under threat.
Well, what do you think about that, Charlie Kronic from Greenpeace?
Well, not surprisingly, I'm probably just about as worried as Fred Pearce, and I think that there are a number of reasons to be alarmed for rising CO2 emissions. The first one Fred alluded to, which is the fact that the OECD economies aren't doing very much, and yet global emissions are rising dramatically. And as a result, concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are going up. That doesn't just mean rising temperatures, that means increases in ocean acidity, which affects enormous aspects of the world's food supply. It has big impact potentially for extreme weather events, and the likelihood, given the policy environment we're in, where all attention is being focused on economics and almost nothing on the relationship of industrial activity to the environment and growth, means that almost zero attention is being paid to it at the moment. So it's bad news for a number of reasons.
Well, the global output of carbon dioxide jumped by the biggest amount on record, as we said, according to the US Department of Energy. But what are those countries with the most carbon emissions in 2010? Let's have a quick look at this point in the discussion. China's on top of the list. China pumped about 2.24 billion metric tonnes of CO2 emissions in 2010. Then US comes in second place with 1.4 billion metric tonnes of CO2. India produced 564 million metric tonnes of the gases. For Russia, the figure was 461 million metric tonnes. As you head further down the top 10 list, we can see that Iran pumped about 157 million metric tonnes, while Saudi Arabia pumped 135 million metric tonnes of CO2. Fred Pearce, what do you think of that country-by-country breakdown?
Well, that breakdown is pretty much what we've seen in the last few years, but we are certainly seeing the emergence of developing countries moving further and further up the league table. Now, in terms of tons of carbon, if you like, tons of coal burned per head of their population, their figures remain very low. China's figure is about a third per head of population to the figure in the US, for instance, and India is much lower. But nonetheless, their populations are so large that they are beginning to dominate carbon dioxide emissions. And that is concerning while they're still so dependent on the dirtiest fuels.
Fred, these are just statistics. It's quite hard for people who aren't scientists and experts to work out what this all means. I'm going to ask each of you, I'll start with you, Fred. What does it mean for the state of the planet as we approach, further into the century?
It means the risks we're running from global warming over the next few decades are increasing all the time. Remember that those emissions mostly stay in the atmosphere. They don't disappear, they accumulate. So the concentration of carbon dioxide, the gas that we're most concerned about, is rising year on year and is keeping on rising. And there's more to come. And that is essentially the planet's thermostat. That is going to dictate in the long run the kind of temperatures that we face and the kind of risks that we face, not just from average temperatures, but from the really scary extreme weather that some people believe we're already experiencing. Not just higher temperatures, but also greater floods and more intense droughts. Those are the things that are coming down the track. And the more carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere, the more hostages to fortune we have, the more risks that we're running. Nobody can quite predict what's going to happen as a result of the rising temperatures, but we can, I fear, look forward to scarier weather, more extreme climate, more climate refugees, more people just suffering from unpredictable weather.
Charlie Kronic, you heard Fred say that no one can predict it. I'm going to ask you to predict, though. Present for me the sort of scenario we could be talking about decades from now.
Well, the biggest issues are the ones that Fred already pointed to. So disruption of global food supplies, disruption of global water supplies, which obviously will have a huge impact on agriculture, usually in the most vulnerable parts of the world, so places like sub-Saharan Africa, but also on places that are providing enormous amounts of food for the world's global commodity markets, such as the central United States or Australia, which has virtually been in a drought for more or less the last decade. And also, I think there's another really important thing to remember, which is that a global average rise in temperature doesn't mean that it's going to rise steadily and gradually over years and decades. The biggest changes in temperature are taking place at the poles, and the impact on the Greenland ice sheets, on the Antarctic ice sheets. The melting there will actually genuinely affect sea level in some fairly dramatic, potentially some fairly dramatic ways. And considering that around 60 to 80% of the world's population live on coastlines, the potential impact just from sea level rise alone, even if you discounted everything else, is breathtaking and seriously worrying.
David Henderson, it sounds like a nightmare for our children and our grandchildren. Do you agree with this, or is it just scaremongering?
Oh, I wouldn't say it's necessarily scaremongering, but it's not my picture of what's likely. Fred said and I absolutely agree with him, it's hard to predict exactly what's going to happen. And there are three stages of prediction, I think. First, you have to go from the emissions figures, which we've just been discussing, to the likely effect on concentrations, which, as Fred says, is what really counts. Then you have to go from the concentrations to the possible effect of that on temperature changes, and then the effect of the temperature changes on the various things that Fred listed, and Greenpeace representative listed also. And for me, there's an uncertainty about all these, and the idea that they're absolutely settled is wrong. Fred suggested, I think I agree with him, that there was great uncertainty about the consequences of the temperature rise. So as I read it, though I'm not a scientist, there's a great uncertainty about the likely temperature rise. There's even uncertainty about the concentrations. And the main message I would try to convey, which has been borne in on me the longer I stayed with this subject, which I came into entirely by accident, the main message I would like to put over is that how little we know firmly about how the climate system works, and the risks that there may be, because the risks are not on one side only, the risks of taking very drastic measures to curtail emissions which are not fully justified.
Fred Pearce, what do you say to that? The science isn't yet certain.
The basic science is very certain. We've known for 200 years that carbon dioxide, the gas that we're talking about, is a greenhouse gas. That means it traps the sun's heat. We know that there will therefore be a warming trend. We don't exactly know how fast it will go because there are uncertainties in there, or what the consequences will be, especially for individual weather systems. We have to think about systems like the monsoon. What happened if that were disrupted? That would clearly be very damaging for billions of people. But those are the kind of risks that we run. But I agree very much that there are huge uncertainties in here. I think the first thing that one would say would be not to row fast in the wrong direction. And what concerns me most about the statistics that we've heard about today is the increasing use of coal, a very fast increase of coal. We know that coal is the most dangerous of the mainstream fuels to use for our energy supplies if we're worried about climate change. And yet, far from retreating from using coal, we seem to be more and more reliant on it. And that is a real danger. We should be thinking about other fuels much more actively, whether they're renewables like wind and solar power and geothermal perhaps, or nuclear power if you like. I'm not a great fan of nuclear, but nuclear is certainly a low carbon option that we need to be thinking about. We really have to start heading in the right direction rather than heading in the wrong direction.
Charlie Kronic, I'm sure you would agree with that, wouldn't you? A rise of 8% of the burning of coal.
Absolutely, and I'd just like to add, I think there's one thing that's really worth considering, which is, what does uncertainty mean? Uncertainty in scientific terms doesn't mean that we don't know if something's true or not. What it means in the case of climate science is the extent of the impacts are uncertain. So they might be bad or they might be very, very bad. So, the idea that something is uncertain doesn't mean it's not true. I think the one thing that is absolutely certain is that if we continue to increase burning fossil fuels in general, and coal in particular, in the rates that are being proposed and measured at the moment, is that the likelihood of staying under a dangerous level of temperature change, whatever you think that is, 2 degrees, some people think it's less than that, of global average temperature rise, gets vanishingly small, less than 50% if our emissions continue as they are now. And if you were going to get on an airplane that had a 50% chance of crashing with really, really dramatic impacts, you wouldn't say, oh, well, it could go one way, it could go the other, I'll take the chance. I think realistically, we still just barely are in a political and economic space where you can start to make real reductions in the growth of emissions, particularly in the developing countries. But if
Charlie,
we keep growing, as Fred put it...
Do you think anyone is listening to all of this? I mean, even this report, even these rather dramatic figures, you try and find them on the front page of the US Department of Energy website. They're not there.
Well, I think that's a fair point, and there is no question that the global, media, public discourse is totally focused on, and has been really since 2008 on the global economic crisis. But I'd suggest, and not just me, plenty of other people would suggest, for example, the OPEC or the International Energy Agency, who are hardly on the same page as Greenpeace, say a dramatic and significant increase in global average temperature rises is going to have a huge economic effect, a big, serious downturn, and it's not going to be well distributed, it's not going to be evenly distributed, and it's not going to be easy to predict. So even if you don't care about the environment and all you care about is the economy, to continue to dig yourself into a deeper and deeper hole as far as environmental and economic impacts goes isn't very smart.
Fred Pearce, it's not the people you have to care about the environment, though, or get to care about the environment. It's the politicians, isn't it? And we're coming up to another conference taking place in Durban. Do you think they're going to do anything this time?
I fear not. I've been to too many of those conferences. I was in Copenhagen in 2009, where people really did think, most of the world's leaders went there, and there really was hope of getting a real deal. Since that, the heat's gone out of things, in the political sense at any rate. There's been more concern about the global economy. And when there are short-term crises of the nature that we've had in the last 2 or 3 years globally, it's very difficult to get politicians to focus on the slightly longer-term issues, such as climate change. It's, I guess, politically inevitable, but we are storing up such problems for ourselves in the future in the way that we stored up problems for ourselves by being complacent about the global economy through the 1990s and the first decade of the 21st century. I fear that we are storing up problems for the future right now in our complacency about climate change.
Complacency, David Henderson, would you agree? What do you think governments should do when they meet at the end of this month in Durban in South Africa?
I agree with Fred that nothing much is likely to come out of Durban. First, because there's still a huge gap between the respective positions of the developing countries as a group and the developed countries, the OECD member countries. That hasn't changed. It was revealed once again as extremely serious at Copenhagen, last year again at Cancun, and I think this year also it will make it very difficult to secure any really substantial agreement on how to curb emissions or new measures to curb them. And secondly, as Fred has been rightly emphasized by both the other speakers, the world is now focusing on other issues, and they're simply not, governments are just not sufficiently concerned about what might happen in Durban. I think it's turned into a sideshow. Now, Fred says talked about the dangers of this. My attitude is rather different. I think I'm alone in this discussion in not being so sure about what is known. I'm much more agnostic about this, it's possible to say with confidence about future temperature changes and their effects. And the sort of changes I would like to see in policy are really rather different. I would put it this way: I don't think much is going to happen at Durban or even wherever it's going to be next year. But there are lots of things that governments could do to improve the policies, the way in which they're handling climate change issues.
Charlie Kronic, what do you think will happen at Durban? The other two guests don't think very much. Surely Greenpeace will be calling for something to happen at Durban. How frustrated are you?
Probably as frustrated as anybody who's been to more than one of those conferences has ever been. And there are actually quite a few things I'd agree with David Henderson about there. The tensions between the North and South have been intractable and don't look likely to change between now and December. And to a great extent, that has been the history of the climate change negotiations, that tension between the view from the developing countries that the North is polluted and it's their right to do so as well, and the North looking back over their shoulders. But I think the most important thing is to have a realistic expectation of it. I don't think very much is going to come out of Durban, but what would be terrible is if the process collapsed. Because while it's a sideshow now, there really does absolutely have to be a global framework for addressing this problem, because it's not just one of carbon emissions, it's not even just one of technology, it is one of politics, and it is one of fairness. And the idea that anybody can tell the Chinese, the Indians, or anybody else for that matter, that they can't develop economically and socially is clearly not right. But we can't do it at the expense of cooking the climate. So the tension is, how do you keep the process going in a way that's meaningful, at least, looking into the future, without making deals that are going to make it impossible to reduce emissions adequately in the future? That's
Fred
the real
Pearce,
challenge.
do you think they can keep the process going? Because the Kyoto agreements, they all run out at the end of next year, don't they?
That's right. That's the real problem now, is that we won't have any agreement at all after the end of 2012. I think they will keep the process going, because diplomats are very good at doing that, of keeping the show on the road, if you like. But in terms of a substantive agreement, I think we're probably 3 or 4 or 5 years ahead. There are some things happening, however. It's interesting how since Copenhagen, individual countries have come up and made their own commitments, which they say are unilateral and don't depend on a global agreement. The European Union has been doing that for some years, but China, Mexico, South Africa, even the US have been making various commitments about at any rate moderating the increase in their own emissions. Some of us call this Plan B, and maybe if we can't get a Plan A, a global deal, if you add up all the different bits of the Plan B, we'll at least keep some momentum going in the process. But that's, I think, why the data that we've heard today are so alarming, because it seems that for all this talk of Plan B, national unilateral actions by individual nations, well, where are the results of these? There don't seem to be any results. It doesn't seem as if they're achieving what they're even promising to do unilaterally.
Charlie Kronic from Greenpeace, do you think that Kyoto will get replaced when it runs out at the end of next year? Are you hopeful?
I think that there are a lot of good reasons for keeping the process going and for having something where everybody participates. Because the problem is either you've got to be in it to win it, and for the developing countries who are still looking to the north for concessions, both in terms of emissions, but also realistically in terms of financial support for them getting onto a low carbon track. If they're not in the conversation, they're not likely to get any of those benefits down the road. So yes, absolutely, I think the process is likely to go forward, and it should go forward. But I think Fred's made absolutely the key points. As emissions rates increase, the urgency in this space gets greater, but the urgency in the official process isn't, and that is the real challenge.
David Henderson, it's very hard, isn't it, to get the politicians and the public to concentrate on this issue, particularly now at a time of great economic uncertainty. People's minds are elsewhere.
Absolutely true. But that doesn't mean that people shouldn't be trying to get them to concentrate on the key issues. My picture of those issues is a bit different. I'm not necessarily opposed, as some of my friends and colleagues are, to action to curb emissions. I think, in fact, that governments, given the evidence that they've been given and the line they've taken now for over 20 years, would find it very difficult to say that emissions should not be curbed. What I do think, however, is that in almost every government, including not least the British, this has taken active steps to do this. Not only have those steps so far not produced much of a reduction in emissions, as has been rightly said by both my co-speakers, but they've been extraordinarily costly and unnecessarily costly. All these regulations, subsidies, grants, targets, the whole apparatus has been designed without any serious attempt to calculate relative costs. And the result is that the rather modest reductions in emissions that so far have come about at a considerable cost, which is going to increase as that's continued, and which could have been much lower.
Your view on that, Charlie Kronic?
The focus on costs is important, but it also can be slightly misleading. The reality is that energy infrastructure, particularly in places like the UK, but in other countries around the developed world, has been really neglected. Investment in energy infrastructure has been neglected shamefully for a lot of reasons over the last 20 years. We're going to have to spend that money regardless of whether we spend it on the dirtiest or the cleanest. And we only get to spend the money once because you can't spend billions on improving your infrastructure and then tear it down again a few years later. Actually, realistically, the National Audit Office here in the UK said that a low-carbon future in terms of investment around the electricity sector was going to be less costly than a rapid recovery in a high-carbon framework. So I think that there's plenty of room for both saving money and reducing carbon emissions, but we've got to admit that some money is going to have to be spent reconfiguring the way we get our heat and the way we get our electricity. It's not a question of go green or don't do it at all, but because that money and those investments are going to be made. So we realistically have to get involved in doing this in the most cost-effective way possibly. And
Fred
I think
Pearce,
that actually
last
is one
comment
of the
from
things
you. Are you not worried, though, that important decisions which have to be made are being endlessly deferred?
Yes, I am. I think the political heat has gone out of it, so politicians find it possible to postpone decisions. One of the worrying things is that having failed in Copenhagen, when many leaders put a lot of effort in, not least turning up to the conference, the real leaders turning up to the conference, having failed once, many politicians are a little reluctant to invest political capital in making another big effort when they might fail again. They think that to fail twice would make them look silly. So there's a real I think, danger of politicians just not wanting to engage anymore. They did engage in the run-up to Copenhagen, and we nearly got something important out of that. The danger is that they're now tiptoeing away, and for political reasons, and despite the evidence of the gathering pace of climate change, just really don't want to engage, and maybe we're going to need a new generation of politicians before they start taking this issue really seriously again. As I say, it's quite difficult for politicians to focus on the long term, and maybe this generation of politicians are not capable of doing it anymore.
Thank you, Fred. Thanks to all our guests, Charlie Kronic, David Henderson and Fred Pearce. Our spotlight today on the environment. What shall we discuss next? Let us know by email, insidestory@aljazeera.com, and make sure you join me back here 24 hours from now. Bye-bye.